All right, good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. I am Jen Scott. I'm the events manager at ACCP, and I am excited to welcome you to today's session of our ACCP Partner Webcast Series. This series is intended as an extended learning opportunity beyond our virtual conference, and we really appreciate all of our partner organizations who've generously continued to support ACCP through these webcasts. In particular, I want to thank today's session sponsor, KRAFFT America. If you have any questions for our speakers, please put those in the Q&A box down at the bottom of your screen. If there's a question in there that you also wanted to ask, go ahead and hit that thumbs up to upvote it. That'll move it towards the top of the question box. And if you have any comments that aren't questions for the panelists or for other attendees, go ahead and put those in the chat box. And without any further ado, I'd like to welcome today's presenters from KRAFFT America. We have Ted Hart, the President and CEO, and we also have JESSIE KRAFFT, the Senior Vice President of External Affairs. Guys, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, Jen. Thank you for the opportunity to share with you our insights, what we have learned and what we are learning from grant advisors and charities working together with funders on the front lines of philanthropy, providing impact funding during this COVID-19 global pandemic around the world. What we have to share today is important for all funders and charities to hear as our virtual coalition around the world struggles to hold together a fragile global social safety net, one which is now being stretched as it has never been before. The need is so great, it is being frayed beyond any level that it has been in the past. Many vulnerable populations have relied upon this safety net in the best of times and makes all of us wonder, are we doing enough? What more must be done? How will communities rebuild? The insights that KRAFFT America has learned from our Voice of Charities Facing COVID-19 worldwide surveys draws attention to the very survival of charities in every country on the planet. But we also see resilience. As we learn about the needs, we can begin to imagine new models, new approaches, new partnerships, and new tomorrows. So JESSIE KRAFFT and I will share with you some of what we've learned in these surveys and share with you the questions that we are being asked and the answers that we are providing. So JESSIE, let's get started. How have nonprofits been impacted? And we're going to go on. These are some of the covers from our reports. We just want to draw everyone's attention that you can find our reports at krafftamerica.org/COVID-19 report. But JESSIE, we've had over 880 organizations in 122 countries participate in the first of our two surveys that we have released. And the effect of the coronavirus global pandemic has been pervasive.
Yeah, Ted, through our surveys, we've received countless stories of difficulty, hardship, and fear for the uncertainties that lie ahead. But underlying all of that in this report, and we'll talk about some statistics that we've seen, but underlying all of this fear and uncertainty is this incredible spirit of creativity and energy that we've seen our charity partners have in their ability to continue providing the important services that each of them bring to their communities. And unfortunately, this statistic, as you're seeing here, shows the most grim side of this, that nearly 95% of our charity respondents out of 880 organizations have been negatively impacted. And this is, as Ted mentioned, this was taken in over 122 countries, and we had responses from those countries. So it really shows a broad-based concern for the charity sector generally, in that 95% have been negatively impacted, and 70% have seen a significant reduction in the contributions that they receive. Another statistic that we've seen in our surveys is that 50% are saying that they're going to see decreases in funding of more than 20% over the next 12 months. This is a very real issue for our sector and our world, really, and is changing the landscape and the fabric of philanthropy and civil society generally. Civil society came to be and exists to fill gaps in government and social services, but those roles are now becoming reversed in some countries. Government is stepping in some of these countries to support the nonprofit sector, but but many countries don't have that type of government support. We're seeing some organizations that are receiving grants from their governments, but many are not. And so we're now in this very dire situation.
Jessie, we know that a lot of nonprofits, as you just pointed out, are negatively impacted. There are a lot of communities, particularly vulnerable communities, that rely on these charities. So a lot of nonprofits are taking steps to try to survive. What are some of the steps that we are learning from nonprofits that they are taking to try to keep their doors open?
Yeah, so you can see here there are a number of steps that they're taking. Some of them are, quite impactful to their overall operations. They're, doing things like reducing their operational costs and creating new fundraising campaigns. That was the majority action that many of them are taking now. And then you see that they're also narrowing their service offerings. Many of them are forced to narrow, not only because of funding, but because they can't provide in-person services. Or they're adding new services, which have been helpful to their communities, but they're also doing a lot around reducing costs with staffing. So they're furloughing or reducing salaries, or unfortunately also there have been a lot of layoffs in the nonprofit sector as well. And one of the challenges that we're experiencing and that we're seeing is that KRAFFT America is getting a huge increase in requests to modify past grant agreements. Because the project we had agreed upon with them can no longer take place. And we've been very accommodating with them, of course, working with these donors and charities to make these modifications. And many of these new programs that we're now allowing them to do are supporting their digitizing projects and shifting them to remote access, and then also providing support for these salaries. So hopefully we're not seeing as many of these activities, such as, laying off of their employees and things like that.
It's difficult. There's a few quotes here that I know you wanted to share with the audience today.
Yeah, I mean, it's like I said, these surveys, I've never seen such rich responses come back from these organizations really trying to share their stories and their need. But just a couple of interesting quotes is one, that we really depend on regular project funding and unrestricted funding right now. If we had to choose based on priority, the biggest need is for unrestricted funding. We would then be able to allocate to programmatic or operational expenses as needed, which we've of course seen in their requests for changes in past grant agreements. And
we'll just give a preview for everybody who's paying attention here. We're going to talk a little bit about that on the next slide.
Yes.
And how we can get really sort of creative in that regard. So pay attention.
It's challenging for sure to provide unrestricted funding. And then the second quote is that our main donor froze their grants and grant applications. We could be facing the loss of an entire year's worth of funding. If the funding is not released, our agency will probably dissolve within the next 6 months. Unfortunately, comments like this is not the only one. They're more common than not.
Yeah, and Jessie, some of our surveys are showing that as many as 8% of charities have already closed their doors, and as much as a third of charities believe that it's a very real possibility that they could be forced to close their doors within the next 12 months. Jessie, another very real stress on charities beyond funding is that many charities benefit greatly from corporate volunteers who are now, maybe home or maybe unemployed themselves now, or, just a variety of different things that are not making corporate employees quite as plentiful, and that's putting an added stress on many charities.
Yeah, absolutely. We've seen many organizations have that concern and have had to reduce their programs and services because they don't have that additional support. And they don't have the funding to hire staff to replace those volunteers. So they're really stuck in a very difficult spot of in most of these cases needing, there's more demand for their services and for the support that they provide to their communities, because there are more people without jobs or that need support from food banks or things like that. But again, they're not receiving the funding they need to manage that increased need, and then they have a lack of volunteers able to participate in those activities.
And then some of the stories that we're hearing is some of the people who are in need of the services are sometimes the employees who once were the volunteers and never thought that they would be in a situation where they would be in need of food bank or other services. Jessie, one of the things that KRAFFT America is very, very much aware of is, where many of our donors, individuals, foundations, corporations, their heart is in the right place. They see the need. They contact us and they just want to move the money as quickly as possible. And of course, we want to do that as well. But our promise to them, our stock and trade in what we are here to do, is to also make sure that every single grant is done so with full 100% regulatory compliance. And sometimes those two purposes don't always seem like they're going in the same direction, no more so than during a global pandemic when everything seems like it needs to happen yesterday. So let's talk about what is regulatory compliance and what can donors maybe do differently. And, does equivalency determination and expenditure responsibility still have a place during a global pandemic?
Yeah, definitely. It's an important point, and something that we've been asked regularly by our donors. Unfortunately, the IRS has not eased their guidance or their rules around funding non-501c3 entities, so non-US charities or in general. And so these rules of equivalency determination and expenditure responsibility do still apply when working.
Nor, if I could jump in, Jessie, nor would we necessarily advocate that they do so, because the protections of these regulations are very real protections.
Yes, no, you're absolutely right. And I say that because we have many donors coming to us saying, well, why isn't the IRS being nicer right now?
Right.
So, and it's a challenging question because we, of course, we know that we're asking a lot of these organizations in order to make grants for them in times when they lack capacity. And I'll speak to this question on unrestricted, but first, I think one of the things that's been so interesting is in the beginning of this, in March, we were having conversations with our staff and our teams at KRAFFT America to say, hey, let us know if you start seeing drops in response rates from these organizations or lack of communication from them, because we weren't aware of their ability to stay connected or to stay responsive once everything started shutting down. But actually, we've seen incredible resilience on the behalf of many of the organizations and their ability to stay connected. So many of them, even with these decreased resources, realize that answering these applications and providing the information that we need in order to legally make grants to them is of utmost importance to their operations and their.
Right. And Jessie, in some cases, KRAFFT America rushed funding for increased IT support, increased computers, and connectivity to aid in that in many instances, so that connectivity was not lost. There were a number of charities that reached out to us and said, our employees have no way to be connected at home. And so we were able to rush funding so that as they were required to be at home, they were able to immediately connect. So again, back to regulations and a global pandemic. How do those two work?
Yeah, so, and particularly in this context, as we heard in the quotes on the prior slide, there are many organizations that right now just need unrestricted funding to support their day-to-day operational costs, to support salaries, to support rent and utilities and things like that.
But Jessie, expenditure responsibility has to be restricted, doesn't it? I mean, isn't that sort of a thing? So how can restricted be unrestricted? Is that a real thing?
Yeah, so what we do for this is we work closely with each of these organizations and ask them what they need in their operations. So if we go to them and say, if you had an unrestricted grant right now, what exactly would you do with it? And we take that response and we put it in a restricted grant agreement. So we make sure it is still a project that we can fund via expenditure responsibility. That
I'm going to put this slide up, Jessie, because this might help our listeners here, viewers today, kind of get a sense of what you're talking about here, of how you can take a budget, you can take a need, and with staff such as ours who are really skilled at having those conversations and understanding, asking the right questions, how do you build that bridge? What would that bridge look like?
Yeah, so we are building, we're under expenditure responsibility. We are still building restricted grant agreements around this column of sustainability, and enabling them to apply funds where needed most, but in a restricted grant agreement. So it's enabling them to, to operate in the way that they need without going through the full process of equivalency determination, which is a lot more time and effort on their end, in order to truly be an unrestricted grant. So we're utilizing expenditure responsibility in this way to enable them to support these items that they need most.
Mm-hmm. And that also, of course, we're talking to the donors, right, who have the desire to move the money in the most impactful and need-meeting way, right? So that's meeting both the desire of the donor, but also putting the money to work where the charity needs it most.
Yeah, our corporate donors really have a vested interest in seeing their partner organizations survive. In many of these cases, these are organizations that work in the communities where they have employees and employee or client presence, or both. So focusing on the resilience and sustainability of these organizations is becoming a larger priority for our donors generally. So we're having a lot more of these conversations, which I think is really positive in this space.
So working with people who really understand regulations at sort of a really granular level allows you to meet full regulatory compliance and meet the needs of both the charities and the funder, even during a global pandemic. That seems a bit unreal, but it's true.
Yeah.
So how are donors actually helping beyond that? I mean, there's a lot of very creative ways that we are helping donors really make a difference in a lot of different parts of the world, working with a lot of different kinds of charities. Help us walk through what some of the options, like I almost sort of think of this as there's a menu of ways that donors can really make a difference depending on what their funding possibilities are and the kinds of charities that they're working with. Is that the right way to think of it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so they're taking all of the actions as noted here, and these are all incredibly important actions that I'll speak to. But also, many of our corporate donors, for them, it's been important to maintain a sense of normalcy in their grant making, and that's incredibly important for our grantees as well, who, as I mentioned, have a lot of fear and uncertainty. So to the extent that it's possible or feasible, it's also good as a corporate donor to proceed with your normal grant making cycles. Many donors are providing relief grants on top of their continuation of their normal programs, which I think is another great step to take that is not mentioned here. But yeah, so some of these are really important, and we're seeing a lot of them. Grant extensions. So we work with many project deadlines, and we're approving a lot of extensions to those deadlines, of course, working with the donors at the same time, because events aren't able to happen as planned, or classes can't be offered as planned, things like that. So they're needing timeline extensions or changes of grant purpose, as I mentioned previously. So if we have an expenditure responsibility agreement in place that for some reason they cannot proceed with that project as planned, we'll sign an agreement amendment and work with them to determine the new purpose for the funding that they've already received from us prior to them beginning to spend the funds. Again, focusing on the compliance aspect always. Right. Providing flexible funding to charities, as we've mentioned, or need-based funding, and there are some organizations saying they're not seeing some flexibility from some of their donors as well. So,
so it's a real menu. It's a real menu. Yeah. But Jessie, what's with one of the things that just makes my heart hurt is that in the middle of all of this generosity, all of the donors that we have the privilege of working with and representing, and the great good that we see them create in the middle of this terrible pandemic, and the number of lives that have been lost and disrupted around the world, is that there are people who are intent on taking advantage of others. There are those who are committing fraud, and those who are setting out to do evil in the name of charity. So what efforts does CAF America take to protect donors and to make sure that the charities that are supported are validated charities, and to make sure that the dollars that are entrusted to us are indeed spent for charitable purposes.
Yeah, so for all of those reasons, compliance remains a priority for us in representing our donors, and we are still undertaking all of the standard steps that we would normally undertake in order to understand, you know, that the organization is a legitimate organization, that they're a publicly known organization, that they are in good financial health despite the current challenges or in spite of them. That we have strong grant agreements and due diligence in place with these organizations, so that we can say to our donors that we have confidence that this is an organization that will spend the funds as they've agreed to.
And it might mean structuring the payments or structuring the way that the funds can be used, and in a very specific or different way to make sure that can be done during the pandemic in a way that might not have been structured prior to that, taking into account what is possible for that charity that might be different than before. Moving on, you've got some details here on some corporate donor responses, and then some specific examples as well. So we want to make sure that we get a chance to share these in the time allowed.
Yeah, so again, other corporate responses that we've seen are, you know, there's a lot of talking and listening going on with us, and then with their charity partners as well. And they're allocating new funding to support some relief efforts and planning for this long-term response. They're adjusting their funding priorities and are revisiting some of their strategies to adjust to the current need. They're expediting funding of ongoing projects. So we've had one donor that wanted to continue their normal cycle, but actually advanced it by 3 months to provide a little bit more certainty and relief to the organizations who were.
And that was a big relief to the charities that they supported, because they weren't certain that those 3 months were going to be sustainable for them. So it really made a big difference.
Yeah, so they knew they were going to provide this funding and just decided to expedite it so that the charities wouldn't have to be concerned about it. And then again, providing flexibility.
And here's some specific examples that you were going to share.
Yeah, and these actually came from, we hosted 2 other webinars that are posted on our website with our corporate partners talking about their specific examples. Biogen and Cargill were 2 of the speakers that we invited to share their stories. These are the principles of both Biogen and Cargill's examples.
That's great. There's also other ways that, besides supporting charities, that corporations are lending support. Let's talk about employee assistance and hardship funds. How are they managed, and why do they exist?
Yeah, this is really important and something that a lot of corporations have been asking about. So in a very basic sense, these are funds that enable corporations to provide additional funding to employees that are in need during different times. This can be during hurricanes or other disasters, or even paying for things like medical bills or things like that. But there are some really strict guidelines around what you can fund dependent upon which vehicle you use. So there are a few different options. One is that an employer can form its own disaster relief fund that's not a charitable entity, but of course that's possible, but then it's not tax deductible, so employees would be less likely to contribute. One alternative is to create an employer-controlled private foundation. So you could run this type of program through your corporate foundation if you already have one. But it's important to note that that's utilizing that option makes it only possible for qualified disaster relief, which COVID-19 is, but
all disasters aren't. Right.
That's right. Not all disasters are qualified, and you can only support things like medical bills related to COVID-19, but not things like lost wages or other sideline hardships that they might be experiencing due to this crisis, because that could be seen as self-dealing depending on what you're doing. So again, for a private foundation, it's possible, but very limited in terms of what you can fund. Establishing a public charity for this purpose is possible and would open the options for what you can fund. but you need specific IRS approval, and that takes a lot of time and takes a lot of expertise on your end.
And then you have to manage that charity according to IRS rules.
Yes, and then the final alternative, which we actually do in partnership with E4E, is we work with an established charity that you can, as a corporate foundation, work with an established charity that manages these funds. So it's essentially an account that you work with them to say, here's the type of thing we want our employees to be able to apply for relief. And then that established charity will manage that entire application process, make the selections, make the payments all on your behalf. And with that funding, with that option, the funding capabilities are wide open in terms of the types of hardship that can be.
And Jessie, if all that sounds complicated, it really is. And KRAFFT America has a podcast as part of our Caring and Funding podcast series that listeners can go and listen to that at kraftamerica.org/CAF podcast. And a few more resources that we have, including a listing of the 256 eligible organizations in 55 countries that are validated as providing direct relief during the COVID-19 global pandemic, and that's at our website, kraftamerica.org. And Jen, that's what KRAFFT America has for the ACCP listeners today. And are there any questions?
Yes, there are. We have a couple of questions with the last minute here. So one person is asking if you're seeing any challenges connecting with new donors or difficulty getting in touch with any of the long-term donors.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think some of our donors are. Jessie, do you want to address how our charities are faring in that question?
Yeah, definitely. And there's actually in a little bit of a teaser, we're doing another presentation later today at 3 o'clock to release our third survey results. And this is actually one of the questions we asked in that is how are you communicating with your long-term donors, and are you still receiving support? And they organizations still are receiving, I forget the exact percentage, but we'll share it later today. They are receiving support from their long-term donors, but I think generally they're having trouble keeping in touch with some of them because so many of their touch points with them are at galas or events or 5K runs or things like that.
Or through corporate support, and those ties have been frayed. So it is becoming very difficult for charities to stay in touch with their longer term donors.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Great. One more question before we wrap up. We had someone ask that locally their United Way and many of the private foundations are putting a greater emphasis on the collaborative partnerships. Are you seeing that this is a trend happening on a larger scale across the country?
Well, that trend has actually been a trend for a number of years, and I think it's a healthy one to show collaboration. And many charities can be a bit siloed, and oftentimes they do have resources that they can share. And I think funders who can help bring those resources together oftentimes can create even greater resources for a community. So I think anytime charities can find partners and work together, that's generally to the benefit of a community.
Okay, well, we're out of time. So thank you for everyone who was on the call for the questions that you had. I'm sorry we didn't have a little bit more time to answer those questions. I want to thank Ted and Jessie. You've given us a lot of great information here today. As attendees, you guys will be receiving a follow-up email later this afternoon with some of this great information and contact information for KRAFFT America. So thank you again for being here. We do have additional sessions in this partner series coming in the coming days and weeks, and you can find a full listing of those webcasts and register for them on our website under news and events. So thank you all and have a wonderful day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.